Good evening, everyone. Ian Andrews here with Lakewood Alive. Thanks for joining us tonight for our community conversation about historic preservation. We're very pleased that you're here with us, and we're looking forward to a great conversation with several historic preservationists that live here in Lakewood. They have been gracious enough to share their expertise and skills with us. So we're going to let the room start to fill up. We'll bring some folks in, and then we will come back and get things started. So be back with you in just a moment. Hi, everyone. Ian Andrews here with Lakewood Alive. This is always kind of that fun, awkward time on a webinar where you're just waiting for people to come into the room, but just wanted to come back and say hello, that we're pleased that you're joining us tonight, especially on a really beautiful evening. Maybe you're sitting outside tuning in from your deck or your patio. We're just going to give it another moment or so for a few more people to join us, and then we will get started with our good friends, local historic preservationists, and sharing their expertise. So be back with you in a moment. Okay, folks, looks like we're holding steady right now, so we're going to get started. Thanks for joining us tonight. Again, my name is Ian Andrews. I'm the Executive Director with Lakewood Alive. Thrilled that you're here with us as we celebrate Historic Preservation Month and historic preservation here in Lakewood. We have such a fantastic community. The social fabric is strong, and so is our building stock and our commercial and residential fabric of the buildings that make up our community. And we wanted to have a discussion with you. Before we dive in, I'd like to thank my colleague, Allison Urbanek. Allison is our Housing and Internal Operations Director joining us tonight. Allison is going to be fielding questions. So please, as you have questions throughout the evening, feel free to type them into the Q&A little bubble icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Type them in, and Allison will help us out directing those questions to the panelists, either specifically or to the whole group. So thank you, Allison. And thanks to our panelists who are here. We'll introduce them in just a moment. Really a few of the reasons why we're hosting tonight's workshop and celebrating Historic Preservation Month. Back in 2004, when Lakewood Alive was founded, it actually was founded as Lakewood Community Progress, Inc., and they began with the Main Street program, of which Lakewood Alive was a member of up until 2020. And Main Street was founded by the National Trust for Historic Preservation that sought to ensure that communities across America not only were able to celebrate, but also to reinvest in their historic commercial building stock and historic downtowns. That so much had gone to the suburbs and out to the malls and the shopping plazas that it really was an effort to try to say that these downtowns matter, that these places matter. And we have, while we've moved on from Main Street, we have made sure to keep historic preservation near and dear to our heart as we celebrate the historic building stock that our community has. We are a city of historic homes, and as a streetcar suburb that was built along the streetcar lines that radiated out of Cleveland, running east to west, particularly on Detroit and Madison, we're really proud of the fact that our community has been able to maintain those historic buildings. So we want to talk about historic preservation kind of broadly, and then somewhat specifically around Lakewood. And I think it's been exciting that there's just so many folks who celebrate this effort. It's celebrating the quality and unique workmanship that you really just can't find nowadays, although our friend Frank Scalish may disagree because he's pretty good at his craft. And then it really can also serve as an economic driver for the city. to unlock the potential for tax credits and for investment in historic buildings. So we'll hear more about that in a little bit. And celebrating historic designations, we are thrilled that we've been able to partner with the city of Lakewood and the state of Ohio to be able to create and finally have secured a National Register district, the downtown Lakewood Historic District on Detroit Avenue from Bell all the way down to between Hall and Ethel Avenue. So a real long stretch of Detroit Avenue, working with PlaceMark Collaborative to get that done. That was a long, probably 15-year effort, but done in earnest in about the last 5 years. So there's a lot to celebrate, plus the Clifton Clifton Park South District, as well as the Birdtown Historic District and several local historic designations. So enough about what we're here for. We want to dive right in. I'd like to start by introducing the panelists one at a time and ask 2 questions. So we're going to begin with Michael Fleenor. Michael is with Historic Preservation Group. Michael, thanks for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you being here and lending your expertise. Please say a little bit about yourself, and then the questions I have for you are, what's your role in historic preservation, and what excites you about historic preservation?
Well, thank you, Ian. I'm a project manager with the Historic Preservation Group, and we help facilitate the use of the federal and state historic preservation tax incentives by developing National Register nominations to qualify buildings for the credit and by completing the certification process. My previous experience is almost 20 years with the Cleveland Restoration Society, which is a regional nonprofit, and with the Tennessee Historical Commission, the state office for the state of Tennessee, where I worked with state-owned historic sites. What excites me about historic preservation is I really enjoy helping to uncover or restore character-defining features in older properties, bringing out the greater potential of underused or underappreciated resources. And historic buildings are very much a community asset. And the National Main Street Center has a mantra that there's an economic value to that which is unique. And so I really enjoy helping to find those unique character-defining features that are often lost or forgotten about that can help revitalize a property.
Michael, thank you very much. Let's turn now to Rick Sicha and Marcia Moll of PlaceMark Collaborative. If I can ask you two to please just talk about your work that you do with PlaceMark, and then the questions of, what is your role in historic preservation and what excites you about this field?
Sure. Our firm, PlaceMark Collaborative, Marcia and I established in 2017. We're a historic preservation and community development consulting firm. We were, for example, the authors of the National Register for downtown Lakewood, and we worked with Michael's firm as well on Clifton Park South recently. My background, by the time I was 11, I was doing local history research under the supervision of a high school history teacher. And 10 years later, that led to a graduate degree in historic preservation, and I made the decision to come back to Cleveland, where I had grown up and where, in fact, both sides of my family have been since for about 150 years. And so then I had a 40-year career in the nonprofit and public sectors in the area, in community development, historic preservation, and urban planning, before then setting up the consulting firm with Marcia. And I think what really excites me about historic preservation is the importance of place and the stories behind all the buildings that you just see on a day-to-day basis. And what is it that makes the warehouse district downtown look like the warehouse district, and why is Lakewood different from a place like Fairview Park, and what about that industrial area down in the flats, and just sort of all the stories that go with it. I'm done. Your turn.
Okay. I've been a resident of Lakewood for 30 years after living in various cities in the East and the Midwest. And I've had an over 40-year career in urban planning, community development, and historic preservation. And I think what excites me about historic preservation would kind of echo what Michael and Rick said. I really love architecture, And I love the older cities that have so much character and so much sense of place. And the idea of bringing back neighborhoods, communities, and building on that architecture and character is very rewarding.
Thank you, Rick and Marcia. Appreciate that. Thanks for joining us tonight. Let's go to Peter Ketter. Peter is with Sandvik Architects. Peter, please, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, the work that you do in your day job, and what is your role with historic preservation? What excites you about the field?
Sure. Thanks, Ian. My name is Peter Ketter. So I'm Director of Historic Preservation at Sandvik Architects. We are an architecture firm that focuses almost exclusively on historic preservation, adaptive reuse projects. So I'm not actually an architect by trade. I'm a historic preservationist, and so do similar work to Michael in my job, working on National Register nominations and historic tax credit applications for historic building rehab projects. Again, probably a lot of echoing already been said about what excites me, but I really enjoy watching the transformation, particularly when we get to work on vacant or underutilized historic resources. Just watching the process of those being brought back to life and the excitement that generates in a community, and then also the stories that brings out of people and the personal connections that people have to these properties, and getting exposed to all that is really an exciting part of the work.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for being here. Frank Scalish of Scalish Construction. Frank, if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about yourself. You're coming to us live from a beautiful scene there. Looks like a nice backyard. And your role in historic preservation, what excites you about this field?
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate it. My name is Frank Scalish. I am the president of Scalish Construction. My wife and I moved to Lakewood 13 years ago. Well, actually, we moved a little more than 13 years ago, but we started our business in Lakewood in 2008, so about 13 years ago. We are a full service general contractor focusing mostly on historic properties, and we do utilize historic tax credits. On the flip side, we are also a developer, so we become our own client, and we can see projects from both sides of the coin, which can be rather interesting, and we'll probably talk more about here shortly. Being last and asked this question, I guess I echo everyone else on the panel as far as what excites me about historic preservation. So everything everyone else said, ditto. But I think what really excites me, especially being in the weeds, is all of the surprises that you'll find on these working on these projects, right? So what's in the walls, or little tidbits of history. No two projects are alike, and I get bored rather easily. So this is a perfect profession for me, working on historic properties.
Well, thank you, Frank. Everyone, thanks for answering those questions. And since, while these next three are open to anyone, I'll start with Frank so he doesn't feel slighted, and then we can go to the rest of the group. Frank, why does historic preservation matter? And then team, please feel free to chime in. This is open for everybody.
Yeah, so historic preservation matters on a multitude of levels. And this is just, my take and my opinion, but being in the construction and development field, I do see firsthand that it is extremely difficult to replicate the quality and craftsmanship of these buildings that were built some time ago. So, in essence, once you lose them, unless you have a boatload of money, which not everyone does, very, very hard to replicate these properties. So it matters in that respect. And then, as someone touched on earlier, it's what really makes a neighborhood unique. and adds character. You can build a building, a new building that's rather interesting, and that's great contextually, but it's just really hard to replicate within a community. So if we're in Lakewood, we're differentiating ourselves by our properties because no two cities properties really are alike.
Thanks, Frank. Anyone else want to chime in on why historic preservation matters?
Well, I think to follow up on what Frank said, it's the whole idea of the sense of place that, and really, residents are making that decision, and potential residents all the time, about moving into Lakewood or buying another property in Lakewood. Lakewood would never, if someone needs or wants a one-story ranch house built in the 1960s, you're not going to find that in Lakewood. So what people are really buying into here all the time is the old housing stock, the quality of construction that Frank mentioned, the walkability of Lakewood, and its character, because those people are actively saying, we want to live in old buildings, we want to live in real neighborhoods where we know our neighbors and all the houses are close enough, that the folks, on your block, or somebody else knows everybody else on the block. And it's that sense of community, and it's easy to get to the park. It's easy to walk to the shops on Madison and Detroit. When you even think about someplace like Cleveland Heights, they had streetcars, but that's not how their commercial districts developed. They're in specific nodes at specific intersections, like at the top of Cedar Hill or Cedar and Taylor or Coventry. And it's not that easy to walk around that city, with the distances you might have to go to find shops or just get to things that you want. And so in Lakewood, being on this grid, it is immensely accessible to everybody. And people are saying they support that. And in a sense, then are supporting historic preservation by reinvesting in the community and those day-to-day decisions.
And this may be a little bit of an aside, but for those people that are interested in green building, the greenest building that there is a building that's already been built. So it's important to retain those buildings and maintain them, because there's materials that are already there. You're not sort of using more materials for brick or more stone or wood, or using materials that maybe are not so green, like vinyl siding. So there are a lot of aspects to historic preservation that mesh with the green movement too.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, sorry, I had a little video glitch there. Hope you can still see and hear me.
You're okay.
But yeah, I was actually, Marcia beat me to it, but I do think it's important to recognize the importance of preservation to environmental sustainability, both in terms of the embodied energy that's already contained in the materials that are in those buildings. And so preserving those means that you've got to produce fewer new materials. And then also, I mean, the very real, issue of landfill and buildings ending in landfills, which, adds a lot of volume to waste. And so those are key points. The one other thing that I'd like to touch on that, doesn't often get as much attention in the preservation field, but I also think it's really important to affordability, because oftentimes, even though some preservation work can be expensive, it's always less expensive to rehab an existing building than it is to construct a new one from the ground up. And so preserving the buildings provides a broader range of opportunities for for people in terms of the cost of investing in the property.
Thanks, Peter. If I could ask everyone, why should the average citizen care about historic preservation? What does it mean to not necessarily, those of us who have all bought in and we're drinking the Kool-Aid, but to the average person who lives here in Lakewood? Anybody?
I'd say, when you think about the communities that people want to live in, the most popular cities or cities that are tourist destinations, they oftentimes are historic communities. And I'd also agree with Peter's comment that in Lakewood we have a good building stock that's accessible to a large variety of people, because we have options of small walk-up apartments, different types of single-family housing, different sizes of single-family housing, towers, mid-century towers. We can accommodate a lot of people, which makes for a vibrant community.
And I also think that when you think about the mix of uses that you see in Lakewood, for example, on the commercial streets, it's something that's very different and really helps the health of a community. Because if you take Detroit and to a lesser extent Madison, you've got offices or apartments above retail. You've got apartment buildings adjacent on the side street. And, all of that brings life to a commercial district like that. And the kinds of communities that you see in Lakewood, there's a reason that North Olmsted doesn't look like that. And that's because zoning codes changed. And the type of mixed use buildings, the 2-story, 3-story, retail on the bottom and apartments or offices above, were against the law out there. It was against their zoning codes. And that's why you end up with Lorraine Avenue out, headed towards Great Northern, just retail, 1-story retail buildings, with parking lots in front of them. And, and Lakewood was built before, that kind of trend was happening, because it was before everybody owned automobiles. And so now communities are rediscovering the whole sort of new urbanism movement that started about 30 years ago with Andres Dwani and his firm, developing places like Seaside, Florida, and other developments. It's trying to bring back that what's called form-based zoning, instead of just the hierarchical zoning of industry goes over there, commercials over here, single family houses, apartments, and they're all separated. Now it's trying to bring that all back together, because what people have finally realized after 3/4 of a century is that helps the vitality and health of the community. And LakewoodAlive has their downtown Lakewood, their events are right there in downtown Lakewood, and it really has a chance to showcase that.
I was just going to add too, on a practical level, residents should care because it affects your property values. That's absolutely been demonstrated, and I think it's a significant reason that people do choose to live in Lakewood. And then just on an emotional level, it contributes to all of our quality of life, to live in a place that has these unique qualities, and the aesthetics of a place do contribute to our experience of it collectively.
I'd also add that historic properties tend to be better built than newly built properties, and they last a lot longer. So to the average person, they may not really realize that, but when you're purchasing an older home that's already lasted 100 years with just a little bit of TLC, you can probably get another 100 years out of that. Most of these newly built homes in some of these mass-produced developments probably are not going to last that long. Actually, I would bet that they're not going to last that long because they're made with materials that were not, they were cheaply made, for a lack of better words. So whether you realize it or not, when you're investing, you're getting more bang for your buck out of a historic property. That's very important.
Thanks, Frank. Last kind of open question, and then we'll get into some specific questions. And folks, just as a reminder, please, any questions that you have, go ahead and type into the question and answer section. And Allison, who's joining us, will be happy to relay those either to the whole panel or to specific folks. Open to anybody, why is it important, or what is the importance around having historic districts, of which we now have several here in Lakewood?
Well, I'll start with that. When a nomination is done for the National Register, if you're looking at a neighborhood, a residential area, or you're looking at a commercial district or an industrial district, one of the things that is part of that is explaining why is that area specifically the way it is compared to everything that's around it. So there's a specific kind of character that is exhibited within that historic district. And it's a way to say, hey, this is something that for whatever part of the story it is, stands out from its neighbors in the adjacent area for whatever reason. So for example, Clifton Park looks different from the areas along Edgewater and Lake to the east of it. Downtown Lakewood, which has the tallest buildings in Lakewood, whether you're thinking about the Westerly Complex or the Detroit Warren Building or the old moving and storage building where, oh, I should never try to get into names because this is what happens, so I'm going to let that go. But that concentration, that density of buildings there, that Birdtown, for example, which is another historic district, that those tightly packed residential buildings and the small lot commercial on the outside built as a company town for National Carbon, the original industry that was there, that they helped their workers they either put up houses and the workers rented houses or the workers were able to build houses themselves. Birdtown looks different from the streets that then, are either to the north of Madison or to the west. So that's one of the things that historic districts do. It points out that there's something different about the environment here. Let's tell you a story.
Historic districts also promote a sense of pride for the neighbors that live there, and a sense of identity. For commercial districts, there are financial incentives involved, and historic districts in many towns around the country have been the vehicle to promote heritage tourism, which then brings money into the community when folks visit and frequent the businesses and stay at a B&B or a hotel if that community has one. So they're extremely beneficial.
I think living in a local historic district also gives a homeowner or a building owner a sense of security. Not that things won't change, but that changes that are made thoughtfully and well, and not to keep up with fads or for poor reasons that would, these incremental changes eventually rob a building of its character, and that's hard to recapture once it's gone. I'm from Nashville, and I know down there people are, a lot of residential neighborhoods, people are wanting historic districts because the city's booming, and so there's a lot of oversized, like tall, skinny, two-family houses moving into neighborhoods with smaller houses, and it's been a problem that people want better protections, that the character of their neighborhood is maintained and the scale.
Yeah, I was,
So-
I was,
Oh, go ahead, Peter.
oh,
No, you're up.
thanks, Frank. But yeah, I was just going to, again, on the practical level, historic districts are pretty proven engines for economic development. And what some may not know, but is absolutely true, is that historic districts have been, one of the most significant, if the most significant tools that have been used to drive the revitalization of downtown Cleveland. And over a period of time, various neighborhoods been put on the National Register as districts. And as Marcia mentioned, that qualifies those buildings for historic tax credits and other incentives. So all in one fell swoop, you qualify a very large number of buildings as opposed to going through individually. And then it sort of forces people to think about preservation on a neighborhood scale and really attack it on a neighborhood scale. And again, we're starting to see that in Lakewood, and if you look historically in downtown Cleveland, you can kind of see how that happened over time. And it started in the Warehouse District and then moved up the Euclid Avenue Historic District, and we recently completed the designation of Erie View Historic District. So continuing the march geographically and chronologically, but it's in each case, those districts have spurred massive investments over a period of time, and I think given the time, we're going to see similar results in Lakewood as well.
Thanks, Peter. Frank, go ahead.
Well, Peter, you said exactly what I was going to say, just in different words and from a different perspective. So yeah, putting the developer hat on, it's one less step in the process of securing state and federal historic tax credits, right? And that worked for us in our first Lakewood project commercially, and we're now doing another one, and since then other people are doing it. So as you said, we're seeing that happen in real time here in Lakewood, and it is really promoting the right type of development and the type that's going to keep Lakewood.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We're going to go into questions for the panelists. Before we do that, Allison, any questions to ask before we transition?
We do have a question, but I think it's going to find a nice, comfy place in a little bit here. So we're going to hold off for now, and I think we can get started.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much for that. Let's go to Michael Fleenor. Michael, question for you. And this was a great segue. As Peter and Frank were talking about tax credits, what are historic tax credits and how are they used to invest in buildings and complement projects?
The federal historic rehabilitation tax credit is a credit for income producing properties listed on the National Register or in a contributing building in a National Register listed district. And the program is administered by the National Park Service, the Internal Revenue Service, and the State Historic Preservation Office. And this is a 20% income tax credit against what are known as qualified rehabilitation expenses. And those expenses include the cost of the work on the historic building, architecture and engineering fees, site surveys, legal expenses. They don't include acquisition, furnishings, new additions, or site amenities. And a rehabilitation has to be substantial, and all work has to conform to the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation and be certified by the National Park Service as being consistent with the character of that historic property. And that's where organizations like my company, Peter's company, come in, is to help make sure that projects will be certified that they do comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards. The The Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program is administered by the Ohio Development Services Agency in partnership with the State Historic Preservation Office, the Office of the Ohio Department of Taxation, and the Ohio Department of Development Services in partnership with the State Historic Preservation Office and the Ohio Department of Taxation. And this is a similar credit, but it's highly competitive and provides a tax credit up to 25% of qualified rehabilitation expenses, up to $5 million. And applications are received biannually in March and September. Fortunately, in Lakewood, any locally designated income producing building is eligible for the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit because we're what's known as a certified local government. And that occurred under the first Mayor George, Mayor Thomas George. And it's really just a way of saying that we as a community and as a local government value historic preservation and will undertake certain activities because of that, having a preservation ordinance and that sort of thing. So that's been really beneficial that because listing on the National Register can take up to a year, that helps my company sometimes help an applicant apply for this state credit before they've really completed that National Register process. And what the Park Service and the state office are really looking for is just preserving character defining features, preserving the volume of significant spaces and the historic traffic patterns through a building. But it's not as cumbersome as people might think. It's really developed to help you adapt a building for a new use. So there is a lot of leeway in how you do that.
Great, Michael, thank you. And thanks for not avoiding the alphabet soup of all of the acronyms of the certified local government and all the organizations and institutions with the state. So Rick and Marcia, to kind of expand on that a little bit. So how does the historic district spur investment in communities? Can you talk about that for a moment?
Sure, and let's start by taking a really large example, not a historic district per se, but the same premise of a larger area that's been unified under a specific theme, and then lots of players at the community level and the neighborhood level play off of that. The Ohio and Erie Canalway National Heritage Area is a 110-mile long area that starts in, north end is in downtown Cleveland, where the Ohio and Erie Canal, which was built in the late 1820s, early 1830s, met Lake Erie down in the flats near the Flatiron Cafe and sort of under the Detroit Superior Bridge, that area, moved south through the Cuyahoga River Valley through what is now the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, downtown Akron, Barberton, on into Stark County, and ended at Dover, New Philadelphia. So when this area was designated by the federal government as a National Heritage Area 20 years ago, it unified that whole area under the theme of being linked by the canal and its impact on the state of Ohio and the growth of communities that occurred because of it and their legacies. And so all sorts of cities, are taking advantage of that now. Canal Basin Park is being created in downtown Cleveland with the where the canal had an area for loading and unloading canal boats and transferring goods such as agricultural goods to either warehouses or boats that then went through Lake Erie up to Buffalo and took the Erie Canal to New York, the Hudson River, Erie Canal and Hudson River to New York City. Akron was created because of the Ohio and Erie Canal, because there was such an elevation change that a series of locks were needed to raise or lower the boats to different elevations, and it took all day to do it. Well, what do people do in the meantime? They want something to eat, they want a bar, and commerce started that way. Small towns along the way like Canal Fulton and Navarre and Zor that really were created because of the canal and now have charming little downtowns and sections of old houses that are being preserved. So those partners up and down that 110-mile area, they all have a little different idea for specific projects of what historic preservation and what a historic district means, but it's all about what, you know, Michael and Peter have said related to maintaining the character of the place and the character defining buildings of, you know, of an area. So travelers can take a nationally designated scenic byway the entire length of the corridor and enjoy all of that and spur economic development, you know, along the way with shopping and overnight stays, for example. You know, closer to Lakewood, and this has been touched on a little, that the National Register nominations, you know, it breaks itself into sort of two groups when they're designated. The neighborhoods that are single family owner occupied residential, like the Clifton Parks, like neighborhoods in Cleveland Heights, like most of the city of Shaker Heights. You know, that's mostly honorific because there are no tax incentives related to that. But as Peter pointed out, studies have shown that real estate values are supported, and even in some cases, there's a premium to being located in a historic district like that, because you're surrounded with a lot of you know, like-minded folks and who really are trying to accomplish the same neighborhood goals. And then the other group is where, as Michael just explained, the areas where the buildings are income producing, like downtown Lakewood, most of downtown Cleveland, you know, and so those buildings encourage the use of the tax incentives. It's also important to point out that what the National Register doesn't do. The National Register, even if your property ends up being listed on the National Register, anything is participation in anything related to the National Register is totally voluntary. The government does not impose any regulations on you as a homeowner if you want to use your own money to work on your property. So think, for example, the north side of Clifton Park was designated almost 50 years ago now on the National Register. Well, houses have been bought and sold and renovated, and I think in one case, or two cases, demolished, and there's new construction that's happened. So, you know, the National Register program, if you're involved somehow in a federal effort, so for example, if there was some federal program going on Lake Erie adjacent to Clifton Park or down in the Rocky River Valley on the other side, related to flood control or coastal erosion, then the fact that that neighborhood's on the National Register would need to be assessed as part of that to make sure that that project didn't do any harm to that historic neighborhood. But if you're not participating in a federally sponsored or funded activity, then you are free to do as you wish with your property, and that's important for people to realize.
And as you know, sort of on the micro residential level, as other folks have said, sometimes being in an historic district spurs owners to do more investment, and it sort of creates a community of people that are interested in historic preservation, and they get together and talk about how to do certain kinds of projects. I found when I was working in Toledo that several of the historic districts were very much like that, and they would have dinner parties and then sort of adjourn and talk about the problems that they were having with certain restoration projects, and somebody else would come with a solution, or you know, they would help each other. So it's kind of a bonding experience too.
So Ian, if I can jump in here, this is my cozy place for the question. And Marcia, I cannot agree more with knowing your home and all of the clients that we have through our housing outreach program. We like to commiserate and celebrate our aging housing stock together. We very cathartic to come together with other people and talk about our complicated love-hate relationships in our historic homes. But I could talk for hours on that. But the question that I have is, how do we incentivize people? Perhaps it's maybe talking through this historic registration, but how do we incentivize people to preserve our aging housing stock so that it'll last another 100 years. You know, we don't want to encourage folks to demolish homes, right? We want to keep all of those homes in good shape and on our streets. We don't want any empty teeth on our streets. So can we use any of this to help people, incentivize them to keep their historic homes preserved and in good shape?
I was going to say, I think that goes back to whether it's a block club or neighbors knowing each other, then a lot of it is neighborhood pride and the street that you live on. For example, there were a number of residents in the south portion of Clifton Park, which was just put on the National Register, who made donations to assist in completing the paperwork to do that. That would include their own houses on the National Register. So that to me is an obvious example of, you know, neighborhood buy-in for something like that. You know, you see things like the area on the north side of Lake Avenue between Nicholson and Lakewood Park. And that whole neighborhood that was able to, they raised the money to do street signs and street lamps in that neighborhood to define its character. And so, you know, Allison, I think what all of this gets back to is that those kinds of things are grassroots. And whether it starts with commiserating over the fact that old buildings are always hungry, or the fact that, you know, you've got an active group of neighbors who want to find out more about that type of designation and bring recognition to it. But I think that's where a lot of it starts.
And that's what I saw when I worked in Toledo, particularly in a neighborhood known as the Old West End, which is one of the largest Victorian era neighborhoods in the country. And it all started with grassroots folks moving in. This was probably in the 70s, and learning about restoring their homes and listening to their houses and what the design elements that their houses needed to be put back, and neighbors getting together and wanting to celebrate what they had been bringing back in this very close to downtown neighborhood. And it turned out that they had a festival every June with tours of the neighborhood and musicians and food, and it was a huge celebration, and it brought thousands and thousands of people into the neighborhood, and it's it was always a delight to go to that sort of 3-day celebration and see what people have done in their homes, and having seen it in the 70s and maybe a little earlier when I was a little kid, driving through and these beautiful but very tired Victorian mansions that were boarded up and very derelict looking. And then when we moved back from the East Coast, to see how the whole neighborhood was just blossoming was just wonderful. And it was grassroots, people working together, sharing information, educating each other on the best ways and practices to do things, and having a list of contractors and plumbers that knew old houses and could help them if they couldn't do it. There were people that they could hire that knew how to deal with some of these issues. And the transformation was just amazing.
And you see the same thing in Lakewood with Lakewood Historical Society, and their once every 2-year home tour brings in a lot of people who don't live in Lakewood, and they get to see some of the houses and see how people have worked on them and made them livable. Because a lot of people don't have a lot of imagination for thinking through about some other space other than the one they live in, and they can see how that, with different types of houses that are on the tour, how folks address their needs and make the property beautiful. The Lakewood Alive events bring people in also from outside of Lakewood. It was, I think, a program run through the public library, the Volts March, which was the walking, the group that does the long walks. And there were maps that were made up for being able to walk through specific neighborhoods and streets to highlight Lakewood. There's a brochure about Victorian houses in Lakewood. So I think where all of that really comes is from the bottom up.
And as we were talking, it sort of struck me that, Lakewood has always, or mostly always since I've moved here, has always been very stable, and people maintain their homes. It never got to the point of some of these inner neighborhoods that have to reach rock bottom before people realize what's there and then start to save them. So we don't have anywhere near the kind of work that other folks have had to do.
Yeah.
So, we're really in a pretty good situation.
I was just going to chime in quickly and excellent points from Rick and Marcia. But I wanted to clarify that, unfortunately, the historic tax credits and really most of the incentives out there don't apply to owner-occupied homes. And I would say that's something that's lacking in our field and in our industry, is support for people that want to do the right thing in preserving their homes. There's not a lot of direct financial incentives that are out there. And, I think that's something that, as a preservation community, something that we should be thinking about and working on. I have worked in other communities where they offer some form of property tax abatement to historic buildings, particularly if there's investment made in those buildings. So there are, tools that some individual communities have adopted to try to help with that, but there's not any, holy grail of incentive that a homeowner can do to find cash to invest in their preservation work. And I think that's something that we should all be working on.
I would add to that, the National Trust has promoted and lobbied for historic homeowners tax credit starting about 25 years ago, but I think it's never gotten bipartisan support to the level that it would need to pass. But that would be something that would be attractive, I think, to some of us who spend a lot of money on maintaining our older houses. And I'd also add that they've done numerous studies, they being the National Trust, showing that the cost of doing preservation isn't necessarily more expensive than a non-historic house. And I know one of those that the Trust had on their website at one point, I mentioned them from Tennessee, was Knox Heritage had funded, and looking at 3 similar neighborhoods in Knoxville, one that wasn't designated at all, one that was locally designated, and one that had both national and local designations. And the cost of rehab for all 3 of those neighborhoods was similar, but the one with both designations had the highest level of appreciation. The one with only local designation had the next, and the one with no designation had the least.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for that. Allison, please go ahead.
We are all caught up with questions for the moment, so we can move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's go to Peter. So, Peter, can you talk about the Lakewood Heritage Advisory Board? What does it do, of which you are a member? and the chair. And tell us additionally the difference between a local historic designation and a national designation. What's the difference between the two?
Sure, thanks. So yes, Lakewood does have the Lakewood Heritage Advisory Board. So we are a seven-member board appointed by City Council, the mayor, the Lakewood Historical Society, and the Chamber of Commerce. And it's a group of historic preservation minded people. Some of us are professionals in the field. Others just have special interest or knowledge about historic preservation. And the role of the board is to be an advisor, to educate, inform, make recommendations to city council, city administration, departments, boards, commissions, and the community at large, really on any matters relating to historic preservation. The board was established in 1997, so it's been around quite a while. Some of the significant activities that the Heritage Advisory Board has undertaken over the years, a comprehensive survey of historic properties, authored guidelines on front porches in Lakewood. Most years we have prepared and made historic preservation awards for both commercial and residential properties that have done good quality work around the community. And then in 2009, really spearheaded by the Lakewood Heritage Advisory Board and other preservationists around Lakewood, the city established its historic preservation ordinance. And that ordinance allows for the designation of local historic buildings and districts, which adds another layer of protection and another level of review requirements for alterations of designated local properties. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the second part of the question. But we now have 13 designated local landmarks in Lakewood. Many of those have gone through the designation in order to take advantage of historic tax credits and specifically to accelerate the timing for applying for state historic tax credits. As Michael mentioned, the National Register takes much longer to work through the process. So the local designation has been a benefit to many property owners in that regard in Lakewood. And I know it was also mentioned earlier, but one of the key factors of the historic preservation ordinance and having Lakewood Heritage Advisory Board operating in the city is that it allows us to qualify as a certified local government, which is a formal designation that's granted by the National Park Service through the State Historic Preservation Office. And that opens the door to some grant money. Again, these aren't brick and mortar grants that are going to homeowners, but the city and doing city planning or more community development efforts can tap into certified local government grants. And then special considerations like, again, the fact that the designation then qualifies you for state historic tax credits. So the certified local government designation does have some practical benefits. So the difference between local and National Register designation is significant. As Rick mentioned previously, National Register designation is purely honorific, so it doesn't in and of itself come with any kind of restrictions on what you can and can't do with your property. If you decide to take advantage of the historic tax credits, then you do have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards, which are kind of the national guidelines that are fairly universally applied to historic preservation projects to make sure that they're being done the right way. But if not, and you're on the National Register, you can, if you're not using those incentives, you can do whatever you like with your property. There's no extra review, no difference than any other building on the block. A local landmark is a much different animal. It's part of the zoning code, and it's effectively an overlay, adds another layer to the zoning of your property that says you are designated historic. And in Lakewood, what that means, according to our ordinance, is that any time that you're proposing alterations to your building or your home, if it's a locally designated landmark, then you have to get a certificate of appropriateness. You still go through the Architectural Board of Review, the same board that reviews those kinds of changes for any building in Lakewood, but they're explicitly applying the Secretary of the Interior standards to their review of the proposed design. So it's just a slightly heightened level of scrutiny and a different sort of a different approach to that review. So it does protect them, and it also protects designated landmarks from demolition. There are ways to still demolish a property even when it's locally designated, but it can be delayed. It offers opportunities for consultation with the Heritage Advisory Board and other members of the community to try to convince the building owner that preservation is a better option. And again, sort of raises the bar in terms of what someone has to demonstrate in order to proceed with the demolition. It does also require basic maintenance of the property. So again, so kind of going back to the question about incentives to encourage people to protect their buildings, while there aren't a lot of economic incentives, financial incentives directly out there, the local designation is a tool that does increase the level of protection on a historic building or a neighborhood. So local historic districts are also part of the code. So it doesn't have to be an individual building, although so far it has been. But that's really the key difference, is that the local designation is permanent and sticks with the property and requires that any future alterations are done in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior standards.
Thank you, Peter. And I'd like to add that being a certified local government community did make available a grant that LakewoodAlive was able to apply for in partnership with the city that helped us to generate enough funds to raise funds through two different grant sources, and then an allocation from the city of Lakewood to be able to then go out and hire a team to help us be able to complete the National Register, because that's a huge process that requires professionals way beyond any capacity that we have. And so being able to leverage the CLG status to receive a grant along with the pipeline grant from the state of Ohio, those two things coupled with city investment, that made that happen. So I think that was really important. And then as we think about the National Register, those buildings that don't take advantage of the tax credits, they can do as they wish. However, it still is within the guidelines of the local Architecture Board of Review that does have some significant design oversight, I think to the better, where it ensures that we keep our community unique and it doesn't create that cookie cutter approach. Everything down, from the signage to the windows, without creating undue burdens, but just seeking to make sure that we keep that the aesthetic facades, if you will, intact and complementing the rest of the community. So I think we've got some good tools, and hopefully it helps property owners also bring in more people because they see the attractive facade, they want to go inside and spend some money. So let's transition, because that was more of just a really long thought and not necessarily a question. Let me go to Frank Scalish. Frank, what is the appeal of a historic building to you as both a building owner and a contractor?
That's a great question. So as a building owner, I would say I'm drawn to historic properties. Well, let's say as a business owner, I want to differentiate myself, right? And what more differentiation can you have than from a historic building, right? So there's that perspective. I would say, gosh, how much time do we have? I, you know, I would say as a contractor, historic buildings, aside from all the incentives that we talked about, the appeal there would really be everything that we uncover through the process, right? So from the start of doing research, all the great things that like Rick and Marcia will uncover when we're working on a project with them about who built the building, right? What was their story? Who was raised in the building? What was the main purpose of this property? So you're buying into a property that has a soul, right? There's a history there. There's a soul, something that you don't really get with building a new property, which there's nothing wrong with. I don't want to get off on the wrong foot or sound conceited there, but then you learn about the building and you restore it in a manner that provides respect to the property, and you're breathing new life into an old building. So then it's able to continue that story in some manner or respect. And then there's a sense of pride, right? So hopefully you guys all can agree with that in some form or fashion. But that's just my personal take on that.
And Frank, as you think about a project like the Veronica building, where LBM is, and being able to oversee purchase and oversee construction. I mean, that building is the prototypical mixed use 2-story, commercial use in the first, upper floors residential. What was the appeal of that building in particular to you, where you said, I have a vision here, and I'm in a historic district, so I know that I'm going to be able to leverage these tax credits?
Yeah, that was all kind of serendipitous, to be quite honest. A call for window replacement, right, on a historic property, and naturally the building owner wanted to rip out all the windows and install vinyl. And I said, well, wait a minute here. Why? What's the reason? And it turns out he was getting ready to sell the building. So lengthy conversations happened, and long and short, we end up purchasing the building. That building in particular, while it's not a large building, it has a lot of those characteristics that are really appealing. One of which, the old windows, great. We restored them, we saved them. But another is the glazed brick on the facade really drew me to that building. And I've driven past it, a million times living in Lakewood, never noticed that brick until we were interested in purchasing the building. It's very unique because no one makes it. We could not find a reproduction of that brick anywhere. So I think that speaks a lot about the appeal of that building. It's very unique. It's one of a kind. It's nowhere else, right? So for me as a property owner, that's fantastic, because we're differentiating ourselves in a sea of historic buildings with something that's not available to anyone else. So I think little things like that really do stand out about the building, and there are many, right? We touched on the historic aspect and who built the building, right? Why was it built? We learned a lot about the Terza family, and it was one guy that built this building with his bare hands. That's phenomenal, right? In that day and age, it's just fascinating to me, right? I can go on and on about just that very small mixed use commercial building, right? It's 6 apartments and a storefront, but it's loaded with neat little tidbits. And then you take that and then put it on a much larger scale with a property downtown, and it's amplified by a million, right? Just really cool stuff.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to jump around. We just on some of the questions, Frank, I want to get back to you in a moment, but I'm going to pivot to Michael, if I can. Michael, what are some of the most common projects that you see come through your office? And do the tax credits play an important role in making those projects pencil? And pencil meaning actually helping to secure financing. Go ahead.
Right. Yes, the most common tax incentive projects we deal with are the adaptive use of non-residential buildings for residential purposes. I mean, they're not the only projects we do, but they're by far the most common. So a vacant factory building or warehouse, a department store, an office building, a school, or a mansion turned social club, in one instance, have all been converted to multi-unit apartments. We've worked on the May Company. We're working on the Rockefeller Building downtown now, St. Michael's School in Clark Fulton, College Club in Cleveland Heights. And these projects likely would not have penciled without the tax credits because of the cost to add multiple kitchens and bathrooms and the related mechanical systems where they hadn't previously been. So it's a great way to help incentivize taking a building that might be redundant or might not quite serve the purpose or be needed for the purpose that for which it was originally built, and give it a new use. And these buildings also adapt very well to housing. Many of them have wide open spaces that can be subdivided. They typically have tall ceilings, a lot of natural light, interesting architectural features that make them more desirable in the market than new construction. And as Peter said earlier, this has been really important in downtown Cleveland, where they have a lot of older Class B office space and a declining demand for offices there as people kind of move throughout the region. And so a lot of those have been converted to housing and created a new vibrancy that by increasing the residential population, that in turn, spurs other needed development, demand for more retail, commercial and entertainment venues. Some other projects that we've done that are really interesting is the conversion of I hate the term redundant sacred landmarks, but churches that are no longer needed as churches for office use. And we've done a Catholic church and a Ukrainian Orthodox church in Tremont. We're excited to be working with Frank Scalish on former Trinity Lutheran, and those will make really dynamic, spacious, and unique office buildings.
Thanks, Michael. Allison, do you have a question?
I do. So, Michael, could you talk a little bit about the process when you're talking with someone, whether it's a building owner or maybe a contractor who isn't maybe as versed as Frank? So someone who doesn't really know about tax credits or the benefit, can you talk about how you explain it and maybe, I hate to say the word convince, but convince people to kind of go the route of tax credits?
Well, each project is unique as each building is unique. But as I said earlier, there's a lot of flexibility with the tax incentives. And so we're really looking at preserving volumes of spaces, of significant spaces, the flow through a building, corridors, that sort of thing. And mostly just restoring character defining features. So in the church that I was speaking of in Tremont, what was really impactful at that project was removing a hideous aluminum canopy that shouldn't have been placed on the church that was damaging the masonry, removing it, repairing the masonry, removing other aluminum enclosures that had been put into exterior stairs, for instance, buying new windows, new energy efficient windows, but windows that are sympathetic to the historic design of the building, that fit the building historically, and preserving character defining spaces. That doesn't mean that the space isn't contemporary, that it isn't functional, that hasn't been still rewired for all of the technological needs that a business might need today. And all of that's essentially subsidized as part of the project. But what's important to the Park Service is to preserve the volumes of significant spaces and again, those character defining features.
Great, thank you so much. So Ian, I think we're caught up if we want to move forward.
Great, thank you. I want to go back to Frank then. Some of the context of historic tax credits. That was one of the ways that you were able to make the project work in the Veronica building happen over there at Ridgewood and Madison. But Frank, whether it's on that building or any others, Trinity, anything else, anywhere else you're working, it's not as though it's all rainbows and kitties. So, I mean, can you talk about the pros and cons of restoring a century-old building?
Boy. Well, the pros, I would say, although there are many that we've touched on before, probably the wonderful people that you get to meet with and collaborate with on a project, right, within the community. So, if it weren't for meeting Heather, Veronica tax credit probably wouldn't have happened. And then, Rick and Marcia, they helped as well do the research. And then there's a whole community that everyone we already touched on that you kind of rub elbows with and you just feed off of one another's energy, right? So that's fantastic, right? On that end of things, on the business side of things. And then you're also creating relationships with folks that are working on these buildings, right? I mentioned the owner building this building with his bare hands. Well, these are craftsmen. They're very passionate about what they're doing. So you kind of get, to talking with them as well, and there's a synergy there, right? Working on these on these historic buildings with them. That's pretty fantastic. What else can I tell you?
Well, maybe some of the challenges or some of the things that you've encountered, and either ways that you've been able to not so much work around them, but incorporate or be able to figure out ways to incorporate some of those adaptations that are necessary, but can also maintain the historic integrity of the space.
Yeah. So in particular, some of the challenges, more specifically speaking, layouts in older buildings don't always work to modern tastes, right? So in the Veronica, we had some layout issues, and rather than removing an entire wall and opening up the space in its entirety, we kind of pivoted and did a smaller cased opening, right, or a larger cased opening, but not opening the wall entirely, which still opened the smaller space up in the apartment. So it achieved what we were trying to go for, the overall aesthetic and the layout of the space, and it satisfied the historic elements as well. So it wasn't really from our end a big sacrifice, and we were able to satisfy everyone, and the space is beautiful. So while that can be viewed as a con or a challenge, it really didn't hinder the project very much at all. And quite frankly, the time allotment to where you're the time allotment to where you're held to these standards, in my eyes, is too short. What is it, Peter or Rick or Michael? Is it 5 years? 5 years, and after that, you can do whatever you want with the building. That kind of blows my mind with the amount of money that folks are investing back into these projects that you're able to get from these agencies. I personally think it should be longer, and the barriers to entry really, they're really not that difficult when you have professionals on your team. So hopefully that helps. That's just a very small portion of, larger elements on a project that you could be dealing with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Frank. That's helpful. And Peter, you touched on this earlier, but I didn't know if there's anything to expand with regard to historic preservation pertaining to residential housing stock. I mean, gosh, the vast majority of our community is now 90 years or older on the residential stock. So if you can just kind of go into the historic preservation on the residential side a little bit, please.
Sure, yeah. And, I guess there's a lot of different ways to think about it, but, as we've been talking about a lot this evening, the architectural character of Lakewood, and particularly of the homes that we have here, is a very significant factor in what makes an attractive community to live in, and what draws people here. And a lot of people move here at least partly because of that. So it is really important, I think, to all of us to maintain that character. And that does end up coming down to, individual houses and how to deal with, all these practical problems that we all face on a regular basis as owners of these historic homes. I think one of the big things that preservation has to offer, and that maybe doesn't get enough consideration, is just kind of the level of expertise that's available. I think that the preservation community in general has a lot of good guidance that homeowners can tap into in terms of trying to figure out how to address problems with your siding or your windows or your roof or your front porch, and that it's not just aesthetic guidance or sort of the classic image of the preservationists standing over telling you what color to paint your house. There's a lot of really thoughtful advice out there that I think every homeowner could benefit from, digging a little bit more into historic preservation, breadth of knowledge. And, I think there's just a lot of misconceptions out there about what it means, and about what it costs to do it correctly. And so I think there's just sort of a disconnect sometimes between what's possible and what people believe is feasible. Michael mentioned windows earlier, and Frank brought that up too. A lot of people sort of are automatically going to think about replacing windows, but there's plenty of research out there, and the actual payback on replacing your old windows with new is extremely long, because the energy efficiency really isn't that significant in an upgrade. And there's a lot of good guidance out about how to make things more comfortable and more functional and more energy efficient without going all the way to replacement, just as an example. So I think a lot of times people kind of shy away from the preservation community for fear of what they might be sort of pressed into doing. But there's a lot of really good information out there, a lot of really good knowledge that anyone can make use of. And certainly in Lakewood, there's a lot of people that are willing to help out and offer advice. And I think that as homeowners, to the extent that we explore those opportunities for educating ourselves about preservation tools and techniques, for getting to know the people that are doing this kind of work, I think that there's significant payback in terms of the value of what you can get out of it.
And Ian, if I could do a shameless plug, because why not? Lakewood
Please.
Alive, we have our housing outreach program, as well as our Knowing Your Home program, many different ways to gain access to education about our historic housing stock. It's something that we really pride ourselves on. So I'm happy to answer one-on-one questions. You can reach out to me via email or give a call. I'm happy to come out and take a walk around homes with folks and share with them the knowledge that I have learned, as well as connecting them with people, contractors, as well as other experts, architects, who can help you maintain and preserve your home, because that is something that we definitely believe in. And I am with you, Peter. Replacement windows are terrible. And we can do all that we possibly can. And also don't do interior waterproofing. I'm going to just use this for one more moment for a shameless plug. Please do not interior waterproof your home. So again, we are a one-stop shop for knowledge. So please don't hesitate to reach out, because we'd be happy to help you preserve your home.
Thank you, Allison. Knowing Your Home is a wonderful program, so I'd encourage folks to please sign up and check out those workshops. And the silver lining of this entire COVID experience we've all had to go through is that we've been recording all of them, so they're now available for you to view, whereas we weren't able to do that when we were in person. We'll get back to the questions. I want to pivot back to Frank. Frank, so as we think about housing kind of along that track, do you see a lot of preservation work being done in homes here in Lakewood? Are folks excited about the historic housing stock that we have? We kind of alluded to that earlier, so maybe dive into that a little bit if you would, please.
Yeah, plenty of development going on in Lakewood, as you know and see. To me, I've only been here, it's a long time, but a short time, over a decade. It doesn't really seem to slow down no matter what's happening around us, right? So that's a good thing. We almost have like our own housing market here in Lakewood, and being that it's mostly historic, it's spurring, investment in the historic housing stock. So COVID, for instance, when the pandemic first started, everyone was nervous. Nobody knew what was going on. We thought business was going to stop. And then the exact opposite happened. And we saw folks, probably from sitting at home, looking at their four walls, starting to reinvest in their homes at a rate that was astronomical. Right. So a lot of calls that we were getting were, kitchen remodels, bath remodels, the classic COVID addition that is going to expand your kitchen, expand master bedroom, and add a bathroom upstairs. Everybody wanted to do that. And that's continued, right? It keeps going. So, that just goes without saying. Whenever there's historic properties, obviously there's going to be historic growth and reinvestment in historic properties. But we've seen that happen at an astronomical rate here in Lakewood for whatever reason. I can't really tell you. And the fun thing about that is, you're getting to work with these homeowners. They are spending more time in their homes, and they're reinvesting in this community that we're trying to build and develop together, right? So it's pretty amazing.
And Frank, a quick follow-up: are you seeing that folks who have been here for a long time want to reinvest in their home, or new residents, and are people of a younger age embracing historic preservation?
It's all across the board, to be quite honest. And as of late, we've seen it all. So there's a lot of aging in place, which is a big buzzword. People deciding that, hey, I've got this asset that's existing, even though I could sell it and make a bunch of money. I love Lakewood and I want to stay here. So how do I age in place? How do I make my home more accessible? We're doing a lot of that. There's people that did the downtown thing, or they've been in Ohio City or Tremont or Gordon Square or insert name here, East Side, and they want to move back to Lakewood because it is walkable, it's safe, it's community oriented. So we're seeing a lot of that, right? People coming from the outside back. There's also folks that have moved away for whatever the reason may be, work or to start a family. They're coming back to Lakewood because it was home, right? Cleveland was home. There's also people that, and this is more on the investment side, so you can view this as good or bad, but there's people that don't even live here that are investing solely in properties here as an investment opportunity, and they're renting them out. So it's gangbusters, and it's all across the board. There's no one single investment that we're seeing right now.
Got it. Thank you, Frank. Thanks for touching on that. We've got a final question for Rick and Marcia. You have just a treasure trove of experiences, and I love hearing you talk about the towpath, because I'll tell you, as someone who likes to get on a bike and ride, also appreciates historic preservation, and would rather spend my dollars in a downtown ice cream shop or restaurant or whatever it might be than out on the highway. Boy, I'll tell you, some of the communities, they're just gems to ride through, and it's so enjoyable and fun. And even as a team, the LakewoodAlive team, we, before COVID, would take an afternoon and ride the towpath from the north side of Akron to Peninsula, have lunch, and then turn around and go back. And it was just a really nice, wonderful day. So I thought it was a great example. But can you just talk about some impactful projects that you've seen throughout your research and your travels and experiences?
Sure. Briefly, and this kind of gets back to what Frank said about the soul, celebrating or finding the soul of a building. Two examples here locally, and then one out of town. Tinnerman Lofts, an industrial building on Fulton Avenue near Lorraine. Part of the neighborhood revitalization is Ohio City is not just 25th Street anymore, but it's going out Lorraine Avenue into the West 30s and 40s. Nondescript industrial building. Turns out that they were a leader in stove manufacturing here in Cleveland, and then solved one of their own manufacturing problems by inventing a new kind of fastener. Nuts and bolts tightened too far, cracked the porcelain enamel steel plates in the stove. So they invented a new kind of fastener, got rid of the nut, and instead inserted onto the bolt a bent little piece of sheet metal that was simply pressed on. It caught in the threads of the bolt and didn't vibrate loose, and it was impossible to over tighten. What they then discovered was the automobile industry, followed by the US military in World War II, turned out to be far bigger clients for that type of fastener called a speed nut, which is still manufactured today. It's one of the standard fasteners. And the guy who ran the company just sort of thought of it one night, mocked one up in his basement workshop, and took it to work one day. Now it's 51 apartments and 30 different floor plans. They've got a Tinnerman stove as part of this wide-ranging art installation that they have. And in fact, one of the Tinnerman family members is actually going to move in because they think it's so cool. The other one locally is the future home of Cleveland Whiskey down in the Flats. So this is going to be a little further south in the River Valley, kind of in line with Progressive Field. If you were to go due west and down the valley, it's on the West 3rd Street Peninsula. A building that's 44 feet wide and almost 500 feet long. And the answer is why? Well, the why is that this was one of about a dozen companies who ran wholesale fruit auction businesses in the northeast quadrant of the United States in the early 20th century. And every year in the 1920s, about 4 to 5% of all fruit sold at wholesale in the country went through that building. 2 railroad sidings on one side pull up 24 refrigerated rail cars of fruit from all over the country, loaded into the building, put boxes out on display. The buyers come in the next morning, they look at those, they go upstairs to the auction room. Everything is auctioned within a couple hours, and then everything is loaded out the other narrow side of the building onto wagons and horses, or later into trucks, and going to other railroad yards for shipment around Ohio, or to other wholesalers in the Cleveland area, or restaurants or hotels, or even the fruit peddlers would buy from them. So that's going to be the kind of almost the linchpin building on that whole peninsula, which is now controlled by a small group of owners for revitalization and extend the public experience along the riverfront, for example. The out-of-town example was we were in Kansas City in their warehouse district called West Bottoms, and doing the first historic district in that area. And that warehouse district looked like Cleveland's in the 1970s. Upstairs completely vacant, marginal uses on the first floor if they weren't simply vacant. And these buildings were just sitting there. Now a Cleveland developer has gone in and redone a major furniture company building, and another company that made canvas sacks for grain. And totally different though, compared to the warehouse district here, which was clothing, wholesale hardware, and other things related to the clothing industry. And down in Kansas City, it's things related to agriculture and agricultural products. There was a company that bought fruit and made preserves and syrups. There was an outlet for tractors, companies that produced agricultural implements that people would need on farms. It was built right at the place where the first bridge went across the Mississippi River to open up into what's on the other side, Nebraska, right? Help me with my geography. Kansas. Sorry, Kansas. I should realize that they're wet and dry. To Kansas. And so it was really interesting for us to sort of walk back 40 years in time and to see all of these buildings being unused and go, wow, what potential. And that's exactly what's happening out there now. And now there's retail going in, the buildings are being used for apartments, and there's like a whole new neighborhood in Kansas City now. So there you go. So it's always about, learning what's there and still surprising ourselves. One of the other things that we do every time the Lakewood Historical Society has their home tours is we write the house histories that are given as gifts to the owners who put their houses on the tour. And we always joke that it's like, one of these days we're going to come up with a building where nothing happened. And that's never happened because there's always interesting things that have gone on in a building and who these people were and why they were there and what's happened. And it's just something we just continually find enjoyable. So there you go, some quick examples. And we're going to put in one shameless plug too. If you want to find out more, if you're a Lakewood homeowner and how to research your house, on the Lakewood Historical Society homepage, under the research tab, is a heading called House History Research. And that's a great place to start to find out about building permits, the previous owners, what they did for a living, and all of the background about the house you live in. I'm done.
Thanks for sharing. Those were really fantastic stories. As a history nerd, I find it so interesting because you're right. I mean, every building has a story, but the depth and the breadth of what you guys do to understand them, I think, is really great. So thank you for sharing that. Sure. And I'll tell you, I used to live in the Federal Knitting Mills building at 29th and Detroit on the north side of the street, way before Hingetown was even a word or a thing. And living in a former textile factory was fascinating. And it was the first place I lived in because I grew up in a very suburban Rhine development. I loved it, and it just reinforced that this is the type of building stock that I really appreciate and that I love. So thank you for sharing those stories.
Sure.
Go ahead, Rick.
Oh, no, I said sure. I'm sorry.
Great. All right. So friends, we're nearing the end of our time. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A. Let's have final thoughts from the panelists to give you a chance if you want to offer any final questions. So I'm going to start with Michael Fleenor. Michael, any final thoughts or words of wisdom for the group?
Sorry, just that I feel so thankful to live in Lakewood. I think we have, it's such a unique place, beautiful place, and it's a place worthy of our attention, and I hope it continues to thrive.
Great, thank you, Michael. Frank, we'll go to you. Any final thoughts for us?
Yes. if you are on the fence of historic preservation, don't be intimidated, right? Don't be intimidated. There's a lot of resources out there that of folks that are willing to help. And there's really no wrong answer. There's no one that's going to be hanging over your shoulder. Everyone's kind of here to help. It's a very friendly community. And, you know, I would just say if you're on the fence, reach out and do take the plunge.
Great. Thank you, Frank. Peter, any final thoughts for us tonight?
Just, you know, thanks to everybody for listening, and you know, keep up the good work in preservation around Lakewood. Again, I'm really proud and happy to be a resident here, and doing any small part to help preserve this community is a worthwhile endeavor. So, thank you.
Well put. Thank you, Peter. Rick and Marcia, anything from you?
Well, I think we would echo what Michael and Peter said about, you know, loving Lakewood. And many, many, many years ago, when we were looking for our house, we were looking on both the west side and the east side. But, you know, we love the housing stock in Lakewood. We love the walkability. And we realized that Lakewood gets far less snow than the east side.
Well put. Thank you. And Allison, any questions? And then any final thoughts that you have to share?
So we did have a question about how people can participate in historic preservation if they aren't a building owner or a homeowner. So Peter or Rick and Marcia, could you talk about any sort of volunteer opportunities or how you could get involved with LHAB or the Historical Society or any other preservation groups that you may know, or Frank, anyone really on this call? Any ways that people can get more involved in historic preservation here in the community?
Well, we would chime in that the Historical Society does have a committee that works on researching various research projects on buildings in Lakewood, and that's certainly where we would suggest Noreen Prim is the person who handles that. And if someone would just call the Lakewood Historical Society number and ask to be put in touch with her, give them a chance to sort of pass the message along, and you know, and have her get back to you. That's a great way to start. It's a great way to learn more about the community and pick up some interesting thoughts. That's how I started when I was 11. You know, it still applies now. It's you know, it's a great way to dive into something and just explore.
Yeah, I'll certainly echo that. I mean, the Lakewood Historical Society would be a great organization to reach out to. At Lakewood Heritage Advisory Board, you know, we're not really that type of organization, but we do hold public meetings every month. So the fourth Thursday of every month. Our meetings are virtual these days, but you can find it on the city's calendar. And if there are things that you're interested in, or you know, you can look through the agenda, and you know, we welcome the public in those meetings. So that's another way to kind of, you know, find out what's going on around the preservation world in Lakewood.
Great, thank you. So I think the only thing I have to add is just thanks. I've enjoyed hearing and learning about all the amazing things that are happening in our great city. So thank each and every one of you for your time, whether you're a panelist or a participant. At least from my seat, it's been a really interesting conversation tonight. So thank you.
Well put, Allison. I couldn't agree more. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to be a part of hearing from some local experts. And Michael, Peter, Frank, Rick, and Marcia, thank you so much for lending your expertise and support. You too also have very busy lives, and so we appreciate you taking time out of that to help us have this conversation. Allison, thank you for your help and your questions and for participating as well. So I think I see Frank may have just unmuted. So Frank, any final comments before we break?
No, thank you, Ian. We appreciate it. It was a pleasure.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. Everyone, thanks so much. We hope you have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you some here in the near future. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.